Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I am Fifi Peters. On the agenda today, by 2050, a quarter of the world's people will be African. The continent's population is projected to double from 1.2 billion today to 2.5 billion in little over 30 years. The population growth is putting pressure on the continent's resources and its land use. But can large tracts of land set aside for conservation survive the economic demands of Africa's growing population? Our panel will discuss this scenario. In Commodity Corner this week, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are cooperating to influence cocoa prices with this month's start of the 2018-2019 season. We will get the views of an analyst on this new strategy. But first, Saudi Arabia is one of the bidders for a stake in South Africa's military technology and defense company, Denel. Money is not an obstacle for Saudi Arabia. It has the world's second largest proven oil reserves. The problem lies in its increasingly tarnished reputation. Joining me to discuss Saudi Arabia's possible stake in Denel is political analyst Mothlabane Modupi. Mothlabane, thanks for your time once again. I mean, as Denel, should they be getting into a relationship with a country like Saudi Arabia, given what has happened recently?
Well, it's a catch-22 because on that one hand, we need the money. We need to stabilize Denel, and Saudi Arabia has the capital. But on the other hand, the moral issue whereby they have a large number of human rights violations, and they've also been proving that they sponsor Islamic extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS. So in this case, let's first look at all the players in the field and who gives us the best deal. However, with the best deal, they already gave us a loan, so we'll be more inclined to swing in their way.
Sure. So would you say that Denel is maybe pretty desperate for their money at this stage, or perhaps it could have another option?
Well, the other option for me personally, I feel that if we want to chase an inclusive economic growth in South Africa, we have to find local bidders, not just the ones in the Asia, like UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar. But it is cash-strapped, Denel. Apparently, there are job cuts happening, so the money is needed urgently. Yeah.
I mean, human rights and the issue of ethics used to be quite important for our foreign policy. I mean, would you say that it's still as important right now, or, you know, you need to look at saving jobs and you need to look at saving the company in not looking at human rights?
With that, we need, as I said, we need to save the company. So they tend to look away with human rights. However, we can also look at a couple of years ago in CAR, Central African Republic, there was a rebel group, and the guns and machinery they're using, they were from Denel, but who complained? No one.
Right.
So clearly we are more inclined to money first.
Are we not at risk, though, of alienation? I mean, if we do just look at the money from the rest of the world, from other countries. I mean, we are seeing that Germany is not allowing exports to Saudi Arabia given the circumstances. Canada is threatening to cancel a multi-billion-dollar defense contract, yet we still want to pursue a relationship with them.
Well, if you look at our economy, it's diversified. So we know that if a couple of countries alienate us, there are a couple of more that will easily trade with us, more in the Asian markets. China,
sure,
more like Russia, even Brazil, you see. So, as I said, we look at the money and we analyze what we have to lose. Yeah.
Do you think that arms controls in this country, rather, have become less strict?
It's tough to say. It's tough to say because when you look at the African countries, it's war. Most of them have wars going on and rebel groups. Where do they get the money? Where do they get the arms to actually engage in that war? Most of them, it's there now. Most of them, it's all the other countries all around. So arms control we tend to shy away from them, and we're more profit-driven.
But I mean, as a political analyst in this country, do you think it will be good for South Africa to ultimately pursue this deal, Denel?
Yes, because it will save it, and because when we have an alternative player as a shareholder, it will be more efficient because they have a profit motive to it. It will also reduce political interference, which is one of the reasons why Denel is shaky. Lastly, Denel will be back to its glory days, where it was one of the biggest export manufacturers of arms, because Saudi Arabia is actually one of the largest importers of arms, so we need that financing. Yeah.
I mean, we know how Denel got into trouble largely. It's the same story for most state-owned companies, you know, maladministration, too much of corruption, a bit of looting here and there. But do you think having the Saudi Arabians on the Denel board could pave for a better future for Denel? You say that, you know, you see a possibility of Denel returning to its former glory, but with such partners that, you know, allegations regarding the killing of the Washington Post journalist, we see the extreme measures that they are willing to allegedly go to. So is Denel also not at risk?
Okay. Well, we have to look at all the other potential players. Who doesn't have a controversy? Which other country doesn't have? Even America has. Look what they did to Syria. Look what they did to Iran. Look what they did to Libya during Gaddafi. All the other countries, they have skeletons in their closet, if I may put it. So we have to argue, right now we have to argue the less of two evils. Who's less bad? But all of them are bad, nonetheless.
Sure, wow. I think let's leave it there. Okay. Thanks so much for your time. Okay. Now, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana produce about 60% of the world's cocoa. This season, the two West African countries are working together to set a floor price for the commodity to protect the livelihoods of cocoa farmers. Our Capital Connection correspondent, Anazi Zoti, asks an analyst if the strategy will work.
George, thank you so much for joining us here on Capital Connection. Let's start by talking about the cocoa prices across the continent. How are they performing?
Well, we've definitely seen cocoa prices improving a bit over the last month. They were below 1,500 a tonne in mid-September. They've risen to almost just over £1,600 sterling a tonne, which is a good sign for the start of the season. But that said, they're still well below where they were the middle of this year or even previous years as well. So prices are relatively low and remain in the same range. What is interesting is how they have set the prices in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana at the beginning of the season, which takes account of this.
Talking about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, will they be working together to kind of harmonize the prices for cocoa production?
Well, they've been promising to for years, and they recently signed a declaration saying that they would coordinate the launch of their fixed price for the year. And they did. They both announced it on the same day. Ghana is 7,600 cedis a tonne, Cote d'Ivoire 750 CFA francs a kilogram. And how that compares in real terms in US dollars, it means Ghana's price is around 4% higher. If you bear in mind that there is always a premium for Ghanaian cocoa simply because cocoa bod is more reliable over the years, and the fact that in Ghana you have inflation between 10 and 15%, it's likely that this margin will be eroded over the season. And I think that's positive. You need some margin, but if it had been 30, 40%, that would have encouraged smuggling from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana. And that's what they wanted to avoid.
How will this actually affect multinational companies such as Hershey's, Lindt, and Nestle?
Well, I think they've set a decent price for the fixed price. And the reality is that these large international conglomerates, which have multiple different businesses, are fighting battles on all fronts against new disruptors, and to try and keep their market share and keep the interest of consumers. So when it comes to the cost of cocoa, generally speaking, that's not a huge impact in terms of a lot of the big confectionery companies. They can often switch to different products. But I think at the moment we've seen this period of relatively lower prices has been very good for these companies. They've massively increased grind, and we're seeing a real rise in confectionery sales as well, on the back of strong global growth. So generally speaking, I think this rise in prices, the moderate one, hasn't really hurt confectionery makers, but we'll have to see. If it's to rise substantially more over the coming months, then that will put a squeeze on their profits, particularly in chocolate and confectionery.
I mean, it's very beneficial for the multinational companies, but not so much for the farmers. A lot of farmers are actually not making profits, even though there is an increase in price. And why is that?
Well, I think a lot of the problem is farmers are just not getting the financing and the help they need at the beginning of the value chain. There's a lot of efforts by Cocoa Board, the CCC, a lot of other government agencies and international organizations to try and get farming and expertise to the start of the value chain. But the reality is that most African farmers who make cocoa, they take the whole risk themselves. If the crop is a failure because of disease or bad weather, they take the full loss. And there's very few banks or institutions who are prepared to lend to them. So that really is the key, is to find a way of getting financing to the start of the value chain, so the farmers and the smart ones, the entrepreneurs, can really expand production and show their capability. There are ways of doing it, particularly through digital and mobile, but it's not easy, and that explains why it still hasn't happened very effectively to this point in time.
What do you think, Edward, will happen to the prices for cocoa in the mid to long term?
Well, the interesting thing is got quite an even balance when it comes to supply and demand. We've had a very strong start to the season in Côte d'Ivoire. They're well ahead of where they were last season, and it looks, the prospects are good for the new 2018-19 season. It's still relatively early in the day to be able to judge how the whole thing is going to go. So I think that basically is a positive in terms of production. But on the other side, we have very strong consumption. There is rising confectionery sales. They've held very strong in the most mature markets. And so ultimately that means that should see prices remain in the current range that they're in, which is, let's say, 1,400 to 1,600 pounds a ton. But there's always the possibility of a shock to the market. And there is a lack of financing available at the beginning of the season in Côte d'Ivoire, particularly because of issues with Saf Cacao, which was recently liquidated, and off some of the banks. And so that taken into account, we could see some spikes in prices if this situation develops further.
Wow. All right. A spike in prices. Thank you so much, George, for your time.
Thanks, Anazi. Coming up after the break, our guests discuss whether conservation in Africa can survive the demands of the continent's need for economic growth in the coming years. Joining me to discuss the future of conservation is from Kigali, Charles Karangwa, the technical advisor for the International Union for Conservation of Nature for Forests, Landscapes and Livelihoods program in Eastern and Southern Africa. In Lagos, we are joined by environmentalist Desmond Majekodunmi, and in Cape Town, Ian Little, the senior manager for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. Charles, beginning with you, is economic growth and conservation incompatible for Africa in the future?
Let me start by making a couple of observations here. Number one, the Africa narrative as a continent is rapidly changing from the dark Africa to the rising Africa and Renaissance Africa. And this means quite a lot when we talk about development or economic growth and conservation. The second observation is conservation is not just about protecting the wild animals or wild plants. Conservation is rather that interface between the human and the wildlife and the nature. So if then we say the two, conservation and development or economic growth, is in conflict, actually we are totally wrong. That's from my first point, it's a wrong view, because economic growth is built on number one, the environment, number two, there's the economic development, and number three, there's a social development. So those three pillars strongly together joined, that's what makes economic growth. And
right.
That's how it becomes sustainable. And
right.
I therefore don't agree that it's in conflict.
Right, okay, so you don't think that they are in conflict. Desmond, do you share the same view?
Well, it depends on how far ahead you're looking. Definitely to have the sort of economic growth that we have been trained to desire, you need to really massively exploit the natural resources of the earth. And we've locked into a very interesting socio-economic system now that requires a lot of consumption, almost unlimited consumption. But the question has to arise. The big question is, how can you have unlimited consumption when your resource base is very limited? The planet is actually very small. You know, here we are talking around the planet. It doesn't take very long to fly around the planet. So we have to reorientate ourselves in terms of our economic growth. But the fundamental thing, it has to be done sustainably. That's why the United Nations is pushing sustainability. It must be done sustainability. If it's not done sustainably, then it is definitely detrimental to Africa's growth economically, sociologically, and otherwise.
And Ian, to bring you in here, I know you're doing quite a bit of work to secure more grassland for conservation purposes. But what do you say to those that say, look, the number of people that are going to exist on the African continent are growing rapidly. These people need homes to stay in. These people need resources. So now you trying to secure this land for conservation purposes, it's in conflict with the needs of the people.
So yes and no. With increasing human populations, there is a massive exponential increase on the demand for natural resources. And that in itself illustrates the importance of maintaining these natural ecosystems in a pristine state to provide those resources for the people that require them. Water is at the epicenter of that. Without fresh water, people simply won't survive. So we need to make sure that in developing the growth of the economies of the African countries, that we sustain natural areas in order for the ecosystem services to retain their functioning for the benefit of people. And the key thing there is strategic planning. So we need to work very carefully with those that are planning the development in all of the countries in Africa to make sure that development is done alongside the protection of key areas.
Gentlemen, could I get your views on tourism here? The continent is seen largely as a tourist destination. I mean, is tourism the panacea here, or does it conflict with other development agendas?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I wanted, just as I respond to your question, to come back to what we call the economic growth and conservation conflicts. And exactly, you brought in a very important element of the Africa economic growth, which is tourism. And we are seeing the tourism in most of African continent is really, based on the wildlife, the animals in the park and different protected areas. This is contributing quite significantly. I'm taking an example of the country in Rwanda, where 12.5% of our GDP is from tourism revenues. And last year, we recorded more than $400 million US from tourism. And that's actually part of the economic growth. And the big investment should be actually put in how do we protect and conserve these resources, the natural resources that actually bring quite significantly, contribute significantly to our economic growth. And as I mentioned earlier, that balance, that what drives the economy sustainably than the other way around.
And then, Desmond, to bring you in here, do you think that the governments on the continent right now are taking conservation seriously?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I think some of the nations are. I think the Kenyans always have, and they're getting tremendous benefit from it. The Rwandans have jumped in big time. Uganda, to a degree, South Africa, yes, definitely they are, but unfortunately, they're not taking it nearly seriously enough in light of the latest information we're getting. The information we're getting, particularly the one that's coming out of the United Nations, the one that's coming out of the International Panel for Climate Change. They gave a report 2 weeks ago, it was released, on the implications of what will happen to the world and Africa in particular, because Africa is very, very vulnerable, the implications of what would happen if we continued this almost unlimited pollution of the atmosphere, unlimited pollution of the waters, unlimited pollution and misuse and abuse of land resources. And to be honest, they themselves, you could see from the report, IPCC report 2018, you could see from this report that the scientists themselves were very alarmed. They, way back, they hadn't expected that the consequences of our brigandage against the environment, against nature, could be so dramatic. And they're drawing out timelines, and they're saying that, hey, we've got to really, really change our attitudes. So yeah, we're doing quite a bit in some countries. Other countries need to do a lot more. But Africa in general, we need to come together and speak as one voice, because we are vulnerable. We're one of the most vulnerable continents to this problem. And hey, guess what? Guess what? Within our resources, within our soil, we have part of the solution, which is what? The tropical rainforest. Sure. If we massively preserve and protect and regrow the rainforest, we will be able to help to sequester this pollution that has been going on for far too long. So we got to come together, say a lot more, do a lot more, and speak with one strong voice to protect our future.
Sure. And Ian, your view on the government action in taking conservation issues seriously on the continent, and or if you just add to that rather, the impact that you see climate change having on this as well?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things at the moment is that we sit in the trajectory, in the long-term trajectory of time, at a critical tipping point on the planet as a whole, with global populations increasing and exponentially increasing, especially in the developing world. Africa being one of the continents that is seeing the highest rate of increase in population size. And with that, we absolutely need increased input from our governments, so from all of the governments within the African continent. Yes, I agree that some of the countries have shown really good support for conservation efforts within their regions, but absolutely not enough. The key thing here is that long-term sustainability requires conservation now. Short-term degradation will result only in long-term habitat loss and irreversible transformation. So what we protect now will allow for us to sustain our ecotourism into the long-term future. And the reality is that governments don't tend to think in the long term. They tend to think in 4-year spells. Well, gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. We'll leave it there. And that is where we leave it for Capital Connection this evening. Thanks once again to all my guests. Remember, do stay tuned every Monday and every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. Good night.